Get ready for a spine-chilling experience. If you love feeling your heart race and the suspense creeping into the room, you're in the right place. But before we begin, I have an invitation for you. If you truly have the courage to face the unknown, go ahead and hit that like button now and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories. Share this video with someone who also loves the thrill of fear, but be careful. The scariest things tend to happen when you least expect it. Are you ready to face what's coming next? Let's see if you can handle it. The supply ship, Hesperus, was slowly approaching the Flannan Islands, an isolated patch of rock offshore. Joseph Moore, the inspector, noticed something unusual. The lighthouse should be on, he said, frowning at the sight of the dark tower. The lighthouse keepers always kept the light on, but now, only darkness reigned over the island. Maybe they're having some technical problem, suggested the captain, but the tone of doubt in his voice showed that he also found it strange. As soon as they disembarked, the air was thick and heavy, as if something was wrong. There was no sign of life. As he climbed the narrow trail that led to the lighthouse, Moore felt an inexplicable chill. Everything seemed strangely quiet, even the surrounding sea, which usually roared against the rocks with fury, was silent. When the team entered the lighthouse, they found a disturbing sight. The table was set for 3, plates were full, but no sign of the lighthouse keepers. The men's belongings were intact. Boots by the door, coats hanging, even their diaries. It was as if they had disappeared in the middle of their daily routines. Moore found Thomas Marshall's diary on the table. The last entry mentioned an intense storm and a growing fear among the men. But there was no storm reported in the area. What did the lighthouse keepers fear? And, more disturbingly, where did they go? The Hesperus crew spent the rest of the day searching the island. They searched the cliffs, the caves, among the steep rocks, but they found no sign of the 3 lighthouse keepers. As night fell, the mystery began to weigh on everyone. The wind, previously calm, began to howl strangely, almost like a lament. Moore, standing in the lighthouse tower, was watching the horizon when he heard what sounded like a whisper in the fog. Marshall, he turned sharply, but he was alone. A shiver ran up his spine. "I'm just tired," he muttered to himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Darkness seemed to move around him, as if the island itself were alive and breathing. He remembered the words in the diary. "There is something in the storm, something we don't understand." As Moore descended the tower's spiral stairs, the sound of the storm, absent until then, began to echo. Not in the sky, but from inside the lighthouse. A distant thunder that didn't exist. He froze halfway, feeling that if he looked back, something would be there. When he finally reached the ground floor, the wind stopped. The lighthouse was dead silent again. Reading Thomas Marshall's diary continued to reveal a growing despair. It mentioned a devastating storm, giant waves crashing over the cliffs and threatening to sweep away the island. "Ducat is starting to get restless," wrote Marshall. "He swore he heard a voice calling out to him last night. MacArthur is restless too. Something is happening here. Something is wrong." However, there were no signs of a storm at the time. What could have led Marshall to report such a thing? The day after the discovery, the crew still had no answers. They were tired and nervous, and the whispers of the wind seemed to mock their efforts. Moore, however, was obsessed with the diary. He felt that the answers were there, hidden between the lines. The last entry was what disturbed him most. "The storm is within us now. The sky is clear, but fear is like the sea, rising and falling, invading the soul." The words resonated in Moore's mind. What did the storm within us mean? Had the men gone crazy, lost in the isolation of the island? But something didn't add up. Their belongings were intact. There were no signs of struggle or physical desperation. It was as if they had simply evaporated. And then that night, Moore had a disturbing dream. In Moore's dream, he was in the lighthouse tower, watching the calm sea. But suddenly, the waters began to stir, forming gigantic whirlpools. In the center of one of the whirlpools, he saw something rise. A shapeless shadow, almost human but grotesque, with eyes that glowed like fire. The creature stared at him, and then heard the whisper again. Marshall, Ducat, McArthur. The names of the missing lighthouse keepers echoed like a macabre chant. He woke up with a start, in a cold sweat. The dream seemed real, much more than a simple nightmare. This doesn't make sense, he whispered to himself, but he knew something was deeply wrong with that island. The sea seemed to hold a dark secret, something that the lighthouse keepers might have discovered. Could this be what made them disappear? A force beyond human understanding? Moore decided to investigate further. The next day he explored the caves beneath the cliffs, where the sea came and went with force. On the damp walls he saw strange marks, old engravings that didn't look natural. They were symbols he had never seen before, almost like a lost language. He ran back to the lighthouse, his heart beating fast. Perhaps those engravings had something to do with the disappearance. What if the lighthouse keepers had disturbed something that had been dormant for ages? That night, as the wind howled around the island, Moore began to feel the same restlessness that Marshall had described in the diary. The lighthouse, with its thick and secure walls, no longer offered the comfort it should have. It was as if the stones themselves were whispering secrets that were not meant to be heard. As he watched the now calm sea, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Moore turned sharply, but the hallway was empty. "I'm going crazy," he muttered, rubbing his temples. But then he heard it again. Not just any sound, but a muffled cry, coming from somewhere deep. He followed the sound, heading down the lighthouse stairs to the basement, where the wind whipped harder against the walls. In the dark, he found a door he had never noticed before. It was old and locked, but it looked like someone had recently used it. With difficulty, Moore managed to break it open and entered. What he saw inside made him recoil in horror. On the stone floor were the remains of ancient offerings, rusty objects, worn bones, and unlit candles. In the center, a symbol that corresponded to the engravings in the caves. Moore realized that the lighthouse was not just a guide for mariners. It was a place of ancient worship, where something much darker was kept at rest. And the lighthouse keepers? Perhaps they had discovered too late what they were truly protecting. The Hesperus crew began to notice the changes in Moore. He was more distant, more anxious. "Something is wrong with him," they whispered to each other. But no one dared to confront him. Moore spent more time in the lighthouse tower, from where he watched the sea with a fixed gaze, as if waiting for something. He knew that at any moment the truth behind the lighthouse keeper's disappearance would be revealed. That night, the sea began to roar again. Giant waves were forming, even though the sky was clear. Moore hurriedly went up to turn on the light, but when he got there, he felt a presence behind him. He was not alone in the tower. When he turned around, he saw 3 shadows standing at the entrance to the light room. Their faces were indistinct, but their eyes, empty and black, watched him intently. "Marshall, Ducat, McArthur." The shadows approached, and Moore felt terror creep up his spine. The lighthouse keepers were back, but not as living men. Something had claimed them, something they should never have disturbed. He tried to run, but his legs were paralyzed with fear. And then, in the darkness, he heard the words that would seal his fate. "You're next." The storm Moore feared finally arrived. But it was no ordinary storm. The sea seemed alive, as if something colossal was rising from the depths, something the lighthouse had been trying for centuries to keep at bay. The waves crashed against the cliffs furiously, and the wind howled with an almost supernatural force. Inside the lighthouse, Moore knew he couldn't escape. He was trapped, just like the lighthouse keepers before him. The sound of footsteps echoed through the tower again, but this time, he didn't dare look. He knew it was them, the men who had disappeared. They were coming to get him. The island was hungry, and he would be the next sacrifice. The lighthouse, once a symbol of security, was now a prison, where ancient secrets and uncontrollable forces waited to be released. As the shadows advanced, Moore took one last look at Marshall's diary, which lay open on the table. The last entry, written with haste and desperation, said, "The storm is within us, and it will carry us away." The tower door closed, and more disappeared, as did the lighthouse keepers before him. The Flannan Islands lighthouse sat silent, waiting for its next victim. After Joseph Moore's disappearance, the crew of the Hesperus were paralyzed by fear. The waves crashed furiously against the island, and the lighthouse was once again plunged into darkness. The reluctant captain knew they could not leave the island without finding out what had happened. Moore's fate, like that of the lighthouse keepers before him, was a mystery that now surrounded them. "We can't leave without knowing," he said, his voice shaking, as he looked toward the cliffs where Moore was last seen. The men tried, with forced courage, to organize a new search for the island. With each step, the wind brought strange sounds, almost like whispers among the stones. They searched the lighthouse, the caves, and every corner of the island, but Moore had completely disappeared. The lighthouse, which should have been a safe guide, now seemed a sentinel for something much older and more terrible. The feeling of being watched was constant. Night fell quickly, bringing a thick darkness that felt alive. In the sky, clouds were forming, although the weather forecast did not indicate storms. As the men returned to the lighthouse, attempting to stand guard, they heard a disturbing sound coming from deep within the building. It was a howl, followed by a rhythmic thumping, as if something or someone were moving within the walls. "They're here," whispered one of the men, eyes wide with terror. As fear gripped the crew, the captain tried to maintain control. He knew something on the island was unnatural, but answers wouldn't come with panic. While rummaging through the lighthouse's small library, he found an old book covered in dust and mold. It was an even older diary, belonging to a lighthouse keeper from the previous century. "This island is not ours," read the words scrawled across the first page. "We're just intruders." As he flipped through the pages, the captain began to understand that the lighthouse was an ancient place of worship, where past generations performed rituals to keep something dormant. There was a time when men knew the sea needed to be calmed. They needed blood and sacrifice to keep the beast at bay, the diary continued. The lighthouse keepers of the Flannan Islands were not only keepers of the lighthouse, but also of a much darker secret. The words in the diary were full of despair. "Those who hear the voices of the sea never return," read one of the last pages. "If the ritual fails, the lighthouse falls. And when the lighthouse falls, they come to claim what is theirs." The captain, horrified, realized that the lighthouse keepers' disappearances were part of something much bigger. The storm they feared so much was not a simple force of nature. It was a presence, an entity that demanded its tribute. The lighthouse, now completely silent, became a prison for the remaining men. Mist rose from the sea, thick and oppressive, as if it wanted to swallow everything in its path. The captain and his team felt they were not alone. The shadows inside the lighthouse seemed to move in a disconcerting manner, and the sounds of footsteps were heard all the time. Marshall, MacArthur, Ducat, the names of the dead lighthouse keepers echoed in everyone's mind. In a desperate attempt to understand what was happening, the captain returned to Thomas Marshall's diary. The last page, previously unintelligible, now seemed clearer. "They're here. The storm brought them." With each line, it became more evident that Marshall and the others were aware of something terrible that inhabited the island. "There is no way out. The lighthouse is not a refuge. It is a prison." As the captain read, he heard a whisper behind him. The voice was low but clear. "You must complete the ritual." He turned sharply, but there was no one there. The sound seemed to come from inside the walls. The shadows in the room began to lengthen, and he felt an invisible presence pressing against his chest. The lighthouse keepers had not completely disappeared. They were trapped between worlds, victims of a force that would not allow them to leave. As the captain struggled to understand what needed to be done, the crew began to lose their sanity. One of the men, Peter, began muttering to himself, talking about voices in the rock and eyes in the sea. He claimed that during the night he had seen the missing lighthouse keepers walking along the cliff, their shapeless figures dissolving into the mist. Madness was taking over the team, and the captain knew that if he didn't solve the mystery soon, they too would be swallowed up by the island. The ritual. What did they do to keep it trapped? he questioned aloud, while running his hands over the old symbols engraved on the walls of the lighthouse basement. The diary suggested that the ritual involved sacrifices, but what or who needed to be sacrificed was unclear. The sea, always present and vigilant, roared around the island, as if it were alive, waiting for something. The captain looked at the horizon, the sky completely clear, but he felt a storm growing inside him. The lighthouse, once a symbol of safety, was now a monument of fear. They needed to complete the ritual, but at a price no one was willing to pay. That night, the sea howled again, as if calling for the men. The voices that were once mere whispers were now clear. "Marshal, Ducat, MacArthur, you failed." The screams of lost souls echoed in the wind, and the sound of heavy footsteps reverberated on the lighthouse stairs, as if the ghosts of lighthouse keepers were walking there again. Peter, already on the verge of despair, ran to the door, trying to escape, but found only dense fog and shadows waiting for him. "You must complete the cycle," said a voice that did not belong to any of the crew. Something deep in the sea was demanding its toll. The captain, who was now beginning to believe in the impossible, knew that sacrifice was inevitable. The only way to calm the fury of the sea and the voices was to hand him over. But to whom? The men were becoming more and more insane. One of them, David, began crying uncontrollably, begging for help that would never come. The captain looked at his companions, realizing that they would not be able to resist for long. He knew he needed to act quickly before everyone was swept away by the madness that enveloped the island. Desperate, the captain decided to try to carry out the ritual described in the old diaries. He knew he needed to follow the instructions of Marshall and the old lighthouse keepers. "The sacrifice must be made to the sea," said the words engraved on the yellowed pages. With each step, the captain felt he was approaching a dark truth, something the lighthouse keepers could not complete in time. With a rusty knife found among the lighthouse's old belongings, he knew what he needed to do. Someone would have to be handed over to the sea. But who? He, in a final act of leadership, decided that he would not allow his men to be dragged into the abyss. They were innocent. The captain, burdened with guilt and responsibility, made his choice. He himself would be the sacrifice. In the darkness, he walked to the edge of the cliffs, where the sea roared with uncontrollable fury. Voices from the depths began to grow louder, whispering ancient secrets that made him shake to the bone. With one last glance at the lighthouse, he closed his eyes and took a step towards the abyss. When the captain launched into the sea, there was a deafening silence. The wind stopped, the sea calmed, and the voices that once tormented him disappeared. The remaining men, dazed and exhausted, watched in silence as the stillness took over the island. The sacrifice had been made, but the price paid was too high. The lighthouse, now plunged into dead silence, finally seemed to rest. The men, relieved for a brief moment, began to understand what had happened. The captain saved them, but the lighthouse would never stop demanding sacrifices. He had bought time, but the island's famine would never cease. Another cycle would begin. As day broke, the fog slowly dissipated, and the lighthouse remained vigilant. The shaken crew knew they could not tell the true story of what they had witnessed. The island would keep their secrets, just as it had done for the lighthouse keepers before them. Future generations would never know the truth about what happened on the Flannan Islands. Months after the captain's disappearance and the terrible events on the island, a new lighthouse keeper was assigned to look after the Flannan Islands. His name was William Graham, and he was unaware of the dark history surrounding that lighthouse. When he arrived at the island, he was greeted by the same oppressive silence that the others had felt. The lighthouse, imposing and shadowy, seemed to watch him from afar. The first night, while adjusting lamps and checking equipment, Graham heard a distant sound, like footsteps on the lighthouse stairs. He laughed to himself, thinking his imagination was playing tricks. But as the night progressed, the sound of footsteps became clearer, and then, around 3 a.m., he heard something that made his blood run cold. "Marshall, Ducat, MacArthur," whispered the voices, like an echo from another time. Graham ran up the stairs, thinking he might find someone, but the lighthouse was empty. The shadows on the walls seemed longer than they should have been, and the wind howled with an almost human sound. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't understand what. The cycle had begun again. As the days went by, William Graham began to realize that the lighthouse had a life of its own. The doors closed by themselves, objects disappeared, and the sound of the missing lighthouse keepers continued to echo in the darkest nights. "Am I going crazy?" he asked himself constantly. But deep down, he knew it wasn't crazy. The lighthouse was a prison for something he couldn't see, something that called him into the abyss. Each night the sea seemed angrier, and the voices became clearer. They called to him just as they called to Marshall, Ducat, and McArthur. Graham read the old diaries, trying to find an explanation. When he discovered Marshall's diary, he felt the same chills as the captain before him. "They are here. The storm is within us." That night, the voices intensified. He saw shadows moving between the corridors, figures that did not belong to the world of the living. And when he looked out to sea, he saw something rising from the depths, something that waited patiently for the next sacrifice. The lighthouse, silent and motionless, continued its vigil. Graham, like the others, would not survive the secret of the Flannan Islands. On William Graham's last night, the lighthouse was darker than ever. The sea, once a constant companion, was completely silent. He knew the end was near. The voices were no longer whispers. They were screams. "Come to us. You're next." The lighthouse demanded one more life, and Graham had no way to escape. As he walked across the island, he felt the presence of the souls that came before him. Marshall, Ducat, McArthur, and the captain. They were all there, trapped in a dimension between life and death, awaiting the next sacrifice to perpetuate the cycle. The lighthouse was a prison not just for men, but for something much older. Graham knew his fate was sealed. He climbed the tower one last time, looked out to sea, and felt the old fury rise again. The storm that lived inside the lighthouse woke up. And then, like the lighthouse keepers before him, Graham disappeared. The lighthouse remained silent, waiting for the next guardian. For the cycle, dark and insatiable, would never end.